Today I'm going to talk a little bit about a different way to approach the pharmaceutical business model, and it is born out of some experience that largely has been defined by the 28 years I spent with Eli Lilly and Company, and then the 10 years following that early retirement in the biotech arena, and then for the last 14 years I've been involved as a venture capitalist starting new companies. And sort of reflecting back on that, it's pretty obvious that there are fundamental changes going on, and it's a bit of a fool's errand to try to imagine that the model that you have seen is going to be the model that will exist when you expect to harvest the ripe fruit from your investments. So what is NuSirt? NuSirt is a company focused on the excess of energy. And we've heard so much about it, I'm not going to spend much time on this. But we had this interesting idea. Our first investment was in NuSirt when it was developing leucine and vitamin B6 as a nutraceutical for weight loss. So we decided to focus on the area where leucine helps the body allocate energy away from adipose tissue to skeletal muscle. But in order to do this, we recognized if we're going to build a company that's going to develop a pharmaceutical, we have to have a rich IP portfolio. So we invested this capital to actually purchase the IP from the university where it was developed, and took it to a completely different law firm and rebuilt the IP portfolio as if I was still at Lilly. Very extensive. We have 14 issued patents, now 15, all across the world, and it includes composition of matter, which is something that always surprises people when you mention that we're combining a branched-chain amino acid with existing drugs. The coverage includes the diseases you see, and fortunately, in our interactions with the FDA to date, we've received clear indication they view this as a 505(b)(2) pathway, which for those who are not familiar with that FDA nomenclature means that we do not have to do a lot of the preclinical tox work, and we can rely on the original manufacturer's submission for purposes of the CMC sections. So what are we interested in? Much like several other presenters, we have developed our own floral arrangement of this disease constellation. There are, in many ways, the Venn diagrams galore on this. There is a substantial amount of overlap, and in fact, it's hard to believe that these exist as individual disease definitions. They're most likely multiple factors associated with it. In a minute, I'll comment about the fact even obesity is not a single disease. So what do we know? We know leucine activates the pathway of energy metabolism at the cellular level. The activity that we are focusing on does not require central mediation. It alters the process of energy transformation at the cellular level. And what we've shown is the quantity of leucine required to do this is substantially below published study levels that did not indicate any adverse effect. And what we've decided to focus on is the areas of human physiology that rely on the cellular process of energy activation and metabolism, and see if we can't enhance the productivity of those already approved pharmaceutical agents. So the very simple idea is take a known, commonly available branched-chain amino acid, introduce it in combination with an already approved pharmaceutical agent, acting in an area of region that has great interest, and imagine developing a product set out of that science. So here's the ubiquitous diagram demonstrating activity. Our platform involves leucine and co-activating compounds that upregulate NO and amplify AMPK. What we see is in caloric restriction, you'll see the same effects here. In a high-fat diet, you see just the opposite, downregulation of AMPK and upregulation of ATP, and therefore blocking the desired effects. Our goals are the 5, increase, decrease, increase, increase, decrease, and that's the same constellation many of us have talked about. We have clinical data, and so I'll show you that in a minute. When we add leucine and metformin together, we can clearly enhance this productivity that exists here, and when we add a very small amount of sildenafil, sildenafil is the active ingredient in Viagra, and the amount that we're adding is 1 to 2 to 3 milligrams BID, substantially below the 25 milligrams BID, or 25 milligrams per day required for erectile dysfunction. So we believe it's in a region of activity that is even below the already published safety profile of sildenafil. And what we can say now is we've confirmed that sildenafil has a positive impact on eNOS, and when you add the positive impact of leucine and metformin on this circle, we get a very interesting feedback loop which leads to increase in fatty acid oxidation, decrease in lipid accumulation, and a reduction in inflammation. So as I said, we started as a nutraceutical company and pivoted in 2012 after we saw the data, 2013, and said, you know, this data suggests to us that the way this is working, we should partner leucine with metformin. So our first combination that we studied in the clinic was leucine plus metformin. And the idea we were experimenting with was to see whether or not if we added leucine to the minimum labeled dose of metformin of 500 milligrams, we could demonstrate an equivalent glucose lowering effect that we would see with full dose metformin. And the idea behind that, of course, is that would be an alternative treatment modality for subjects with diabetes with perhaps a lower AE profile in that you would have reduced amount of metformin on board. So, So in humans, we have shown and I'll go into those in just a minute, a consistent weight loss. We've also shown that in preclinical, including canine. And in NASH, that was our next trial. We ran after the diabetes trial because we observed an improvement in liver function in the diabetes trial, although it was a very early signal, and we hypothesized that if we did indeed activate the circuits that we talked about, that we would maybe confer a benefit in the deposition of fat in the liver. We ran a phase 2 liver trial. We did not employ liver biopsy for the reasons that Brian and others have mentioned. We used a MRI PDFF, and I'll explain a little bit about the problems of that. But in that trial, we also saw an improvement in hypertension, 5 millimeters drop in mercury, all comers, including those on antihypertensive agents, and improvement in dyslipidemia. So the summary of our 3 clinical trials: leucine and B6, obesity, weight loss, change in adipose mass, and a reduction of more than 1 inch in waist circumference and more than a dress size in women in about 45 days. Also an improvement in inflammatory markers. The type 2 diabetes trial, we showed that the low dose of metformin, that is 500 milligrams BID plus leucine, was equivalent in glucose control to a titrated up 850 milligrams BID dose of metformin. We did not see a statistically different AE profile, although there was a suggestion of a slightly reduced amount of AE discomfort associated with a lower dose. But what we saw in that trial led us to the design of the next trial, which was completed in November of last year. And the target of that trial was twofold. One, we were looking at NAFLD and NASH, and as secondary endpoints, we were looking at metabolic parameters. And in those trials, we showed that we were able to reduce hepatic fat in subjects with NAFLD, but only in the cohort of subjects who had elevated ALT at entry. The less sick patients did not demonstrate the same improvement, which led us to some interesting comments about the method of measurement that we used. But what we also saw in our secondary endpoints that really caused us to sort of even narrow our focus more was unmotivated weight loss across all comers, and in fact in those who were sicker either by elevated lipids, elevated ALT, or elevated blood pressure, the weight loss approached 1% per month. This was a 4-month trial. So a 4 to 5% weight loss, coupled with a loss in blood pressure of 5 millimeters and a material improvement in lipids, 50 milligrams per deciliter. During this last trial, there were no safety concerns, that we had no treatment emergent serious adverse events, and there was no difference in the adverse event profile between the 2 populations. So with that as a background, I'd like to shift to what I believe is a new model. This is a model that we have developed as a part of our conversation around the whole space of Metabesity, and in fact, we're going to talk about obesity, but obesity just happens to be one way into that floral diagram, the blue overlap. You could approach it from a number of areas, but we think this is a more straightforward one. And the idea behind this is that the consumer or the patient, and I want to refer to them hereafter as consumer, has an important role to play in improving their health status, especially in the condition of excess weight. But we want to elevate and improve the dignity of that person's definition of their responsibility so that we can increase ownership. And what we're trying to mimic here is the profound impact we've seen in other industries where when individuals have more of a say in what they do, choose, purchase, buy, or use, the ownership of that decision results in a greater sense of attachment to the decision and, in fact, adherence to the processes necessary to take full value from it. It's interesting to compare the results for compliance or adherence in pharmaceutical terms to the adherence to things that people pay for out of their pocket. One of the interesting data points we gathered was the level of adherence that individuals seem to produce compared to the amount of adherence or the quantity of adherence they have to purchasing and prescribing the medicines for their pets. A veterinarian writes a prescription for a heartworm and flea and tick. There is a much higher percentage of those prescriptions and orders that will be fulfilled every month to take care of the pet when compared to the medicine requirements for the individuals. It's sort of interesting to think about the degree of ownership that is involved there. As I said earlier, we have reason to believe that we are controlling energy disposition, first in the adipocytes through the mechanisms I mentioned earlier, as well as diverting more energy to the skeletal muscle, and in the adipocytes, the reduction of lipogenesis and increase in mitochondrial biogenesis, and lipid oxidation, increased fatty acid oxidation, leading to a net energy transfer from storage to utilization in the skeletal muscle. We haven't completely worked out the mechanisms, and I must give credit to Dr. Michael Zimmel. He's the scientist behind this. I'm an engineer by training, and so my discipline would teach me to look at systems and input and process. He's been fairly extensive in looking at the varying underlying biochemistry and at the cellular level, and has published extensive. He has been doing this work now for 30 years and has an extensive background, and I'm reasonably satisfied that the work that we've done does not have any major negative signals. We still have some things to prove, but we're pretty confident we can move on. Now, a bit of a discussion about the obesity market, and I'm going to talk about it in the U.S. context, although I don't have any reason to believe it doesn't mirror the rest of the world. Each of the gray dots, and you may not be able to see them, there's 1,000 dots on this screen. Each of the gray dots represents 89,000 people. This is the number of people in the U.S. who are obese. So 1,000 times 89,000 is 89 million. The number of people taking a branded pharmaceutical agent are represented by the 3 orange dots, 0.3%. The number who take a prescription on top of that, mainly amphetamines, is 1%. So the market is essentially unserved in such a large way as to be, you have to be careful not to describe the weight loss market as a market that doesn't even exist. But the reality is that number of people who are obese, and many of them know that, of course, and they can see that, are still waiting for a solution. Unfortunately, as was shown by a previous speaker, many of the pharmaceutical solutions carried with it a fairly large amount of baggage. It would not be a carry-on nature. You would have to check several before you'd get on the plane. And a lot of folks are saying, you know, that's just not worth me taking the risk. So what we tried to imagine was, could we, on the basis of the data we've seen in the background we know about leucine and metformin and sildenafil, imagine a weight agent that would be sufficiently safe enough to engage a meaningful number of gray dots to see this as a solution that would help them. So our first question was, well, what are they doing today? And this may not be the case in every country, but we found a wide array of things that consume their time and money to address this problem. Unsupervised diet and exercise, wearable devices that give biofeedback, semi-supervised diet and exercise, over-the-counter drugs, a wide variety of things, supervised diet and exercise, prescriptions, and surgical. This panorama of choices was amazing when we started looking and finding how many people are actually participating in these things, and it's a considerably larger number of dots than I previously showed. So my first conclusion when drawing that is there's already been an activating energy at some level that have caused people to engage in one or more of these elements on the fan. And when you think about it, customer awareness and customer creation often takes the first step is to define a problem, in some cases, they didn't even know they had. When you bought your first cell phone, you probably didn't know that you needed one until somebody told you that you needed one by defining what you could do with it and then defined what you can't do without it. So you didn't walk in saying, I need a cell phone. You walked in saying, I see what I can do with that, and now I want one. The same thing is true with a tablet that you mentioned. We believe that a significant number of patients, and I want to use the word customers again, actually are already activated because they are purchasing things like this. Now, I point out, and you may not be able to see this, unsupervised diet and exercise, $50 a month, heart rate monitor, $50, semi-supervised, about $50 a month, OTC, $75 a month, supervised diet and exercise, $200 to $500 a month, prescription agents now, $8 to $10 a day, and $15,000 for lap band surgery. So common across the first 4 or 5 was a number of $50 a month. So if there's been activation, there's clearly been an indication that this is a price elastic opportunity set. Now, there are different ways of organizing a strategy about how you would approach obesity. Behavior modification, and we know how difficult that is, and we were told earlier that the imprint that we had at youth is permanently stored in our central processing unit, and it takes a lot of replications of alternate signals to replace that memory algorithm. Neurotransmitter that is alter the cravings or alter the mechanisms inside. And those generally carry with it a very long list of undesired side effects. And surgical activities where you either fat restriction, either through surgery or Ally, and I won't comment on the adverse event of Ally. What was interesting as we talked with Adverse is they felt that there was a strong bias in the minds and thinking of physicians that obesity was, they had a lack of appreciation of the complex physiology of weight management, which is essentially around how we have evolved with a reservoir of desire to avoid starvation rather than a desire to be obese. And we defend our body mass through an elaborate system involving the brain, gut, fat cells, and a network of hormones. You may not be able to see it because it's lower on the slide, and I apologize, but this one key expert said, obesity, which represents a dysfunction of this system, is likely not one disease, but dozens. And that may be at the core of breaking the inventory of gray dots into a more useful subset of analysis. However, they all stem from one thing, and that is there is probably an excess of energy on board compared to the amount of energy they're burning. That's what leads to storage. So a traditional way to approach this would be to think about developing a pharmaceutical agent with a goal of charging $8 to $10 a day, knowing full well you're going to have to give a huge amount of discounts to the payers to get it on formulary, and you're going to have to spend a fair amount of money promoting to physicians. You're going to have to demonstrate through trials to show evidence of an economic or societal benefit. And in weight loss, we've already heard many speakers say the loss of weight may in and of itself not be sufficient without showing some other end organ damage or whatever. And there are difficult economics. It heavily relies on traditional prescription and delivery models. We've identified the 6 areas that one needs to succeed at. The clinical regulatory phase, getting the payer involved, and that's not standard. Figuring out how to distribute it and with whom you have to negotiate and have contracts. How much money you're going to spend both in direct-to-consumer and influencing physician. Changing the attitudes of physician and changing patient attitudes. A fairly standard set of things that in the pharmaceutical industry we would have to address. Each of these 6 categories requires an intense amount of energy and design into the clinical trials and your pre-marketing communications. Another option we decided to examine is to disrupt the market and consider it. So if you go back to here, we call this the orange dot strategy. You're simply trying to displace some portion of those 3 dots. It seemed obvious to us that a wiser strategy would be, if we can do it, why not try to take on some meaningful number of the gray dots? So this became our gray dot strategy. And this strategy has embedded in it the fact that there is a low penetration rate and there are vast options, back to the fan a minute, and therefore that there's this belief. So these are things you have to think about overcoming. And what we decided to frame it is the pill, and I know that's poor language, is a complement to a customized weight loss program for which there are unique profiles for each patient and maybe predictive algorithms, and we'll hear some more about the use of information technology to help us. And more importantly, to think of this as an online storefront relationship in which the original prescription would be essentially executed through a telecommunication with a physician. But that would only work if the agents that we're talking about have a reasonably accepted and well understood safety profile, and that it would involve a direct-to-consumer. So what we imagined then is the pill fits into this complement of choices that the patients are already activated, rather than an alternative, which is often the way a pharmaceutical weight loss agent today is viewed, is you spend a lot of money for those agents and there's a concentration of expectation that's placed on that one single agent. In this model, we have eliminated the need for having a conversation with a payer because we're simply going to ask the consumer to pay for this. And as you heard me say, they've already demonstrated a willingness to pay $50 a month. Well, if we price it at $50 a month, that's a reasonable price point for a very large number of people to participate. And it changes the whole dynamics of the economic structure. We don't have to have a sales force. We do have to advertise, but we can figure out an efficient way to do that. And more importantly, we wind up with an effort that depends heavily on customer activation. It's only possible, as I said, with safe and well understood components. And it places the physician in a secondary or support role rather than a primary gatekeeper. We believe, based on some evidence we've seen and some conversation we've had with consumer market research people, that when individuals make a decision to buy something and they pay for it directly, and it's delivered fairly soon to the decision to buy, and it makes a difference in something that they can measure, that there is a much higher expectation of adherence or compliance that will go on versus the other model. So this is our basic model. We're going to try to focus on customers first and personal ownership of a weight plan without trying to jettison anything they're now doing. We see this as supplementary to or enhancing the other activities. And we're going to try to figure out a way to avoid as many barriers as we can. Now, you might ask, well, how is this a new model? Well, it's a new model because I don't know of any pharmaceutical company that's contemplating a new drug priced at $1.25 a day or $1.40 a day. The second thing is most pharmaceutical companies already have established communication vehicles called sales forces into which they want to put new technology. We don't really see a need to build one of those sales forces. why would you incur the cost? Because I think over time we're going to see those positions become more susceptible to different forms of learning. There's no doubt the pharmaceutical sales reps have helped immensely in educating physicians in the treatment of patients and adopting a more complex technology. But a lot of that can be done through other means. And we're seeing that now, as we just saw that Merck's announced a reduction of 1,800 sales positions. Lilly announced a reduction of 3,500, some of whom are sales. I think there are a large number of companies that are going to re-examine the utility function of, in the U.S., paying an all-in cost of $250,000 per person year for a sales rep to make 4 calls per day, when even by best estimates, we are approaching 50% of physicians who will not see a sales rep today. Those dynamics are not going to work economically. The second issue is we can do this because we don't have the investment of $500 million in the development project. This has been a very low-cost budget because we are taking advantage of amplifying existing medicines. So that's our new model, and I'm hopeful that we will find a good outcome at the end, because I think if we can repurpose existing medicines, as already been talked about, where we know a lot about the biology and all of the things that are going on, I think we can address a very large number of serious issues. That's not to say that we should abandon primary innovation, but there are a lot of things we can do with existing medicines, and if we can find ways of making them more useful, more available, less adverse event creating, more friendly, and we can engage the consumer in a sense of ownership in that process, we can really make a trajectory change here. So that's the end of my comments, and I'll be glad to take questions. So anybody got a question? Mike's on its way.
So I just want to understand, there is a physician involved in prescribing the drug. It's just not the person's physician. I'm trying to understand. If you're talking about the metformin and Sudafil, those require a prescription to dispense?
A physician would be involved, or a nurse practitioner, depending upon the state licensing requirement. It does not have to be the person's physician. We envision that there are means via telemedicine that a simple series of questions would adequately inform a physician to determine whether the patient was a suitable candidate for this.
I see. And that's part of the package that you have is?
Yes.
That?
Yes, and of course we'd discuss that with the FDA. We don't intend to try to hide behind anything here. Yeah. As we've looked at telemedicine today, there is a company called Orexogen. They have a product called Contrave, which was already pointed out here, and that's exactly what they're doing now. If you go on the Contrave website, there's a 1-800 number to call a doc, and they will ask you a series of questions, and if you pass those questions, they'll write an e-script for Contrave. We would like to think that our position would have a better adverse event profile than Contrave, and therefore make it even easier. I think this is going to be seen in a number of disease areas. The idea of having to wait in a queue to see a physician to get a prescription for a number of agents really is of questionable value. But I'm not a physician, so maybe others would take exception to that point of view. Yeah. Okay. Brian, you have one?
So just sort of a FDA type question. One of the things that the GI division and others are so obsessed with, anytime there are multiple components, they always ask, is this a fixed dose combination?
Yes.
And will you do a full factorial or a partial factorial?
Yes.
And of course, in this case, knowing that there is a contribution of each component is important, especially given some of the side effects of the Viagra, the sildenafil in kids for pulmonary hypertension. And so if that isn't really needed, it could actually make it a much easier and safer product. It's just, so the regulatory tradition can sometimes make it more difficult to do something novel and elegant like you're proposing.
We have had discussions with the FDA. We visited with them on several occasions, and the FDA's combination policy is you have to demonstrate to their satisfaction that it requires all 2 or 3 agents to be added in order for it to be approved. I should have mentioned that we actually are going to study both leucine and sildenafil as one possible combination and leucine, metformin, and sildenafil as another. We have reason to believe that metformin is actually not contributing meaningfully to the weight loss, but it does contribute to the improvement in lipids and possibly in improved glucose control, obviously, because that's how the mechanism works. So we will have a modified factorial design of some sort. We have found the agency to be very open to using preclinical data to help answer their policy interpretations. And part, we've simply said, if we don't figure out a way to do something like this, figuring out ways of repurposing other agents, either with alternative formulations or in combination with other agents, is going to be so complex, we're going to be back in the $200 to $300 million development cost, and it's going to put prices out of reach, and we're not going to address the underlying conditions. The FDA is not responsible for the economics, and I understand that. But they're also physicians, and every time we've approached it with a patient-centered answer, they seem to respond in a way that, well, let's figure out if there's a way to work together. So I've been very impressed, in fact, with your pharma division. I've had several meetings, and I've found them to be very cooperative. They're struggling mightily with how to do NASH for the very reasons you and I have talked about. It's very hard to figure out what you've done at an early enough stage to know if you've done the right dose without sticking needles in people's side to take a big biopsy. And that's not a long line of people who volunteer to do that for $50. Any other questions?
Joe, this obviously doesn't work for a novel biologic for Alzheimer's. You did list some of the criteria, but could you maybe briefly review the kind of compounds for which this could be a new business model?
Well, we start with the patient and think first that it probably will work best in the models of diseases where the patient actually sees some confirmatory benefit if they are active. I look back to the example of Sanofi's successful launch of Lantus. The real success of Lantus occurred when Sanofi educated both patients and physicians that if you took long-acting Lantus, you would see an absence of a blood glucose spike before breakfast. That patient feedback was a daily feedback. And that propelled the concentration of interest in Lantus to a pretty good level. I would say that it needs to be measured, and it probably needs to be in a disease space where the patients have some remote awareness that improving it would lead to something desirable for them. We may not have fully crossed the education barrier on weight yet, but I think we can in terms of exercise capability and several other things. So hypertension, harder to imagine how the patient's going to know if he or she is benefiting. Maybe there's some devices coming that can measure hypertension in the home, but boy, there's a lot of variability even in a physician's office. I mean, there's even the white coat effect. And so weight, maybe other things. As we get better, and we'll hear a little bit more about it, it may be that we can prick the finger for measuring a wide range of things in the future that will tell us how we're doing on these things like we can today for glucose, in which case that feedback would lend itself to these. But it's going to have to be diseases and agents that will have a fairly safe profile.
I hope your interactions with the FDA were considered by the FDA as serious, because the reason that I'm saying that is that in our experience, the FDA is only serious when you go into Type C meetings, and they don't oblige themselves to kind of approve your program before you've done it. And the reason I'm saying that is that we just have entered or have completed a big add-on program for 2 compounds in overactive bladder, and these compounds were relatively safe. But still, the FDA wanted to put both under the magnifying glass, and we did have to go through extensive cardiovascular monitoring studies. And if you want to do a study with sildenafil, I would predict you have to go through the same scene.
So,
and that's the actual thing currently with regulators.
You never know what the FDA is going to say until, as you say, you present them with a firm decision they have to make. Were those 2 agents that you referred to new molecular entities?
No, they were approved medicines already on the market.
Had they previously accepted a 505(b)(2) pathway?
I don't know that pathway, so I can't comment on that.
Okay.
But both were considered as applicable for combination treatment in the overactive bladder space. And still, there was also a lot of prior treatment by doctors. So there was a lot of
experience.
A lot of experience, but still, we had to go through the official route, and it costed us a lot of millions.
So I would not for 1 minute try to predict what the FDA will say. I can only tell you that the attitude we've received thus far has been very encouraging. And we've approached them with palms up, hands open. This is what we're trying to do. We're trying to solve a problem using existing base of knowledge that is a serious issue for society, and if we can figure out a way to do this, patients will benefit, society will benefit, and hopefully we can see the path forward that is not so much of a hurdle that we can't do it. I mean, it's not unlike challenges that we're facing with the aging study. I mean, you have to sort of maneuver through the lexicon of what is approvable and not, and then you have to figure out what's the angle that doesn't create an untenable precedent for them. And then you have to figure out, well, how am I going to pass muster with the peer review community, the physician community, and then do I have something that is viable? So I don't present this as a fully baked cake, but it is our recipe for how we'll blend up the batter.